Most people think revenge is loud. They picture slammed doors, raised voices, long speeches full of hurt and anger. They imagine someone finally standing up for themselves in a way everyone can see and hear. But life teaches you something different as you get older. The most powerful kind of revenge is quiet. Let me ask you something. Have you ever watched someone walk away feeling proud of themselves, only to realize later they had no idea what they just stepped into? That's what this story is about. And if you've ever been betrayed by someone who thought you were weak because you stayed calm, if you've ever learned that silence can speak louder than shouting, then you'll understand exactly why what she did next shocked everyone. Her name was Denise. She was in her mid-50s, the kind of woman people describe as easygoing or nice, always polite, always composed, the type who listened more than she talked and never needed to be the loudest voice in the room. Denise had been married for 31 years. 31 years of shared routines, shared memories, shared sacrifices. They raised two children together. They survived job losses, tight finances, illnesses, funerals, and long nights that tested patience more than love. She believed she had earned a sense of security. Not perfection, not fairy tale happiness, just stability. That belief began to crack quietly. There was no lipstick on a collar, no dramatic phone call, no sudden confession. It started with small things that didn't quite add up. Money moving from accounts without explanation, a phone that was always turned face down, a man who suddenly needed space but never explained from what. And when she asked simple questions, the answers came too quickly. You're overthinking it. You're imagining things. Why are you being so paranoid? Funny how those phrases always travel together. Denise didn't argue. She didn't accuse. She watched. She listened. And slowly, the truth introduced itself without needing to be named. One evening, after dinner, after the dishes were done and the television filled the silence with background noise, he said it. I think I want a divorce. No buildup, no apology, no visible guilt. Just paperwork waiting to happen. Most people expect a moment like that to shatter someone. Tears, raised voices, desperation. Denise did none of that. She looked at him, took a breath, nodded once. Okay.
That single word unsettled him more than anger ever could. You see, silence makes people uncomfortable. When someone doesn't react the way you expect, it forces you to sit with your own actions. But Denise didn't explain herself. She went quiet. 2 weeks later, the divorce papers arrived in a thick envelope. Official, cold, final. He slid them across the table like he was handing her a receipt. And there it was, that subtle smile people wear when they think they've already won. He had told friends his version of the story by then. We grew apart. She changed. It's mutual. Funny how betrayal always sounds cleaner when it's retold. Denise turned the pages slowly. She didn't rush. She didn't skim. She read every word. Then she picked up the pen and signed. No tears, no questions, no conditions. Just her name at the bottom of the page. In that moment, everyone decided who Denise was. They decided she was done. They decided she had given up. They decided she didn't have the energy to fight. They were wrong. After the papers were signed, something strange happened. Nothing. No angry messages, no late-night calls, no emotional breakdowns. Denise didn't announce a new beginning or seek sympathy. She didn't explain herself to friends or post inspirational quotes about starting over. She simply became quiet. And silence, when paired with patience, can be dangerous. Because while everyone else assumed the story had ended, Denise was only beginning to understand it. At a certain age, you stop fighting with emotion. In your 20s, you fight with passion. In your 30s, with logic. In your 40s, with boundaries. But later in life, you fight with foresight. Denise didn't panic about the house or the money. She didn't rush to prove anything. Instead, she started paying attention. She organized documents, old files, statements she hadn't looked at in years. And without telling a single soul, Denise began to see patterns she had missed before. What her husband didn't know, what no one knew, was that Denise hadn't just signed divorce papers. She had signed the beginning of a plan, and the first thing she discovered would change everything. Denise didn't wake up the next morning with a grand plan. There was no dramatic moment where she stared into the mirror and promised herself revenge, no music swelling in the background, no sudden transformation. Life doesn't work like that. Instead, she woke up the way she always had. Same coffee mug, same quiet kitchen, same chair by the window. The difference was subtle, but it mattered. For the first time in decades, Denise wasn't reacting to anyone else's expectations. She had time. And time, when you're patient, starts revealing things you didn't even know you were looking for. She began with paperwork. Not because she was suspicious, but because it gave her something solid to hold on to, something calm, something orderly. Old tax returns, bank statements, retirement account summaries, documents she had trusted without questioning for years. At first, nothing seemed out of place. And then she noticed something small, a number that didn't quite line up. Have you ever had that moment where you look at something familiar and suddenly realize it's not as familiar as you thought? That's what happened to Denise. One account showed less than it should have, not by much, just enough to make her pause. She double-checked, then checked again. Maybe it was a fee, maybe a timing issue, but when she traced it back a few years, the pattern repeated itself. Small amounts, consistent timing, always quiet, nothing flashy, nothing obvious. The kind of thing most people overlook because life is busy and trust feels easier than suspicion. Denise didn't panic. She smiled to herself, just slightly, not because she had caught anyone, but because she finally understood something important. She hadn't been stupid. She had been trusting, and those two things are not the same. She kept going. The deeper she looked, the more the story changed. Money had been moved, not stolen outright, but parked, redirected, parked in places she'd never paid attention to because she never thought she needed to. You know how when someone's been in control for a long time, they stop hiding carefully? They assume no one's watching. That assumption was about to cost him. Now, Denise didn't rush to confront anyone. That would have been the younger version of her. Instead, she took notes. Dates, amounts, account names. She treated it like a puzzle, not a betrayal. Because once you remove emotion, clarity shows up fast, and clarity is powerful. Here's something people don't talk about enough. When someone believes you're passive, they show you exactly who they are. They talk too freely, they relax too much, they underestimate your memory. Her husband, meanwhile, was enjoying his new freedom, new routines, new energy, a lighter step in his walk. He spoke to her less, but when he did, there was a confidence in his tone, the kind that says, "I'm already past this." He assumed Denise was grieving quietly. He assumed she was overwhelmed. He assumed she'd accepted her fate. And Denise let him believe that. She still answered politely, still kept her voice steady, still avoided confrontation. If anything, she became easier, and that should have worried him. Because when someone suddenly becomes easier during a conflict, it usually means they've stopped arguing and started observing.
One afternoon, while sorting through a drawer she hadn't opened in years, Denise found something that made her stop breathing for just a moment. An old document. Outdated, forgotten, but not meaningless. She sat down slowly, reading it twice, then a third time, and that's when she realized the truth wasn't just about money. It was about leverage, about timing, about the long game. Let me ask you this. Have you ever noticed how people who rush always lose to people who wait? Denise wasn't waiting anymore. She was preparing, but she still said nothing. Not to friends, not to family, not even to herself out loud, because she understood something that only comes with age. You don't announce your strength. You let people discover it when it's too late to stop you. And the next move she made, quiet, legal, and perfectly timed, would set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Not even him. Denise didn't tell anyone what she had found. That was the hardest part. When something finally clicks, when the fog lifts and you realize you're not as powerless as you once believed, the instinct is to talk, to share, to ask for validation. But Denise had lived long enough to know that too many voices can blur good judgment. So she stayed quiet. She returned the old document to the drawer, exactly where she'd found it, and closed it gently. No dramatic gestures, no racing heart, just a slow, steady breath. From the outside, her life looked unchanged. She still went to the grocery store on Tuesdays, still took her walks in the evening, still called her sister once a week to check in. But internally, something had shifted. She wasn't reacting anymore. She was choosing. The document she'd found had reminded her of a decision they'd made years ago, back when money was tight and the future felt uncertain. A decision her husband had insisted was just in case, something practical, something harmless. She remembered signing it without much thought. Back then, she trusted him completely. Now, she saw it for what it was, a safeguard. Not for her, for him. And safeguards can work both ways. Denise began moving carefully, the way you do when you realize the floor might not be as solid as it looks. She didn't confront him about the accounts. She didn't hint that she knew more than she had let on. Instead, she did something far more effective. She asked questions. Simple ones, casual ones, the kind that sound like conversation but are really confirmation. So how long have you had that account? Didn't we used to get statements for that? Do you remember when we set that up? He answered easily. Too easily, because when people think you're unaware, they don't bother lying well. And every answer lined up with what she already knew. That's when Denise understood something important. This wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. And patterns tell stories. She began documenting everything. Quietly, methodically. No emotion attached, no anger driving the process, just facts. Dates, names, transactions, signatures. She treated it like a job, and oddly enough, that gave her peace. There's something calming about structure when your personal life feels like it's falling apart. Now, here's the part that might surprise you. Denise didn't want to destroy him. She didn't want to humiliate him. What she wanted was balance, fairness, the truth. Because when someone rewrites history to make themselves look innocent, the most powerful response is to present the unedited version. While her husband was busy starting over, Denise was busy catching up with herself. She reread old emails, notes, agreements, not to torture herself, but to remind herself of something she'd forgotten. She had always been involved, always aware, always capable. She just hadn't been credited. And that realization did something remarkable. It removed fear. Fear is what keeps people quiet for the wrong reasons. Denise's silence now was intentional, strategic. One afternoon, she made an appointment. She didn't announce it, didn't mention it to anyone. She simply drove across town, parked, and walked into an office she'd never needed before. The meeting didn't last long, but when it ended, Denise walked out with something far more valuable than advice. She walked out with clarity, and clarity has a way of rearranging power. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, the same table where the divorce papers had been signed, and allowed herself one small smile. Not satisfaction, not revenge, understanding, because she now knew two things with absolute certainty. First, her husband had underestimated her, and second, the silence he mistook for weakness was about to cost him more than he ever imagined. But she still didn't move. Not yet, because the most effective moves are the ones made when the other person believes the game is already over, and he was celebrating. Time passed, and with each passing week, Denise became more invisible. At least, that's how it seemed. People checked in on her less, friends assumed she was doing okay, family stopped asking questions once they realized she wasn't going to give them dramatic answers. And her husband? He stopped paying attention altogether. He had moved on in his mind. New plans, new routines, a future he believed no longer included her in any meaningful way. That kind of confidence makes people careless. Denise noticed the carelessness right away. He spoke more freely now, about money, about decisions, about what he planned to do once everything was finalized. He assumed she had no leverage, and because he believed that, he revealed more than he should have. Denise listened the way she always had, quietly, patiently, without interruption. Have you ever noticed how people talk more when they think they're being heard without judgment? It's almost like a confession disguised as conversation. She filed those moments away, not in her heart, but in her mind. Meanwhile, she continued her appointments. Not many, just enough. Each meeting added another piece to the picture, another confirmation that what she had suspected was not only real, but documented. And documentation changes everything. What Denise was building wasn't anger, it was alignment. Every detail began to connect. The old document, the accounts, the timing of the divorce. It wasn't sudden, it was calculated. And here's where the story takes a turn that most people never see coming. Denise realized the divorce wasn't meant to set him free, it was meant to lock her out of decisions, out of visibility, out of what she was legally entitled to. That realization hurt, but it didn't break her. It sharpened her. Because when you understand the intent behind someone's actions, you stop personalizing them. You start responding correctly. Denise adjusted her pace. She didn't rush the process, she let it unfold naturally. And the more comfortable he became, the less cautious he grew. One evening, during a casual conversation that felt almost friendly, he mentioned something he hadn't planned to: a future purchase, a timeline, a plan that assumed certain things were already settled. Denise nodded, asked a neutral question. "Are you sure that's all finalized?" He laughed. "Of course, everything's done. You signed." That sentence lingered in the air. You signed. Yes, she had. But what he didn't understand was that signing wasn't surrender. It was access. Denise went home that night and reviewed her notes again. She saw now what she hadn't seen before: the window. Timing matters in life. Act too early and you're dismissed as emotional. Act too late and the damage is done. But act at the right moment, that's when people are forced to pay attention.
Denise wasn't waiting for justice to happen. She was positioning herself so that when it did, it would be undeniable. And then came the moment she had been waiting for. A letter arrived. Not from him, from someone else. Official, neutral, precise. She read it once, then again, and for the first time since the divorce conversation, Denise felt something rise in her chest. Not anger, not fear, certainty, because the letter confirmed what she already knew. The truth wasn't just on her side, it was documented. And once truth becomes official, it stops being a secret. Denise folded the letter carefully and placed it in a folder she had labeled weeks ago. She closed it and set it aside. Still no confrontation, still no announcement, because the next step wouldn't be private, it would be public. And once it happened, there would be no walking it back. Not for him, not for anyone. The first sign that something had changed wasn't loud. There was no argument, no raised voices, no confrontation in a courtroom hallway. It was confusion. Small, quiet confusion. Her husband noticed it when a routine phone call didn't go the way he expected. A conversation he thought would be quick stretched longer than it should have. Questions were asked. Clarifications were requested. Nothing alarming, just unexpected. He brushed it off at first. People do that when their confidence is still intact. Denise, meanwhile, remained exactly the same on the surface. Same tone, same politeness, same calm presence. If anything, she seemed more at ease, and that's unsettling to someone who believes they've already won. Another week passed, then another, and the confusion grew. A document needed review, a signature was delayed, a process that should have moved smoothly suddenly slowed down. Denise said nothing. She didn't need to, because the moment you stop explaining yourself, people start filling in the gaps on their own. He began calling more often, casual at first, then a little sharper. "Do you know what's going on with this?" Denise would pause, just long enough to make the silence noticeable. "I'm not sure," she'd say. "I thought everything was handled." Those words landed differently now, because they echoed his own. Everything was handled, or so he thought. What he didn't realize was that Denise had shifted the balance weeks ago, quietly, legally, permanently. The folder she'd been building, the one no one else knew about, now mattered. And the people reviewing it weren't interested in emotion, they were interested in accuracy. Denise didn't gloat, didn't rush the process. She let it unfold at the pace it demanded, because when truth moves slowly, it tends to arrive fully formed. He started asking questions she didn't answer directly, started offering explanations she didn't request. Have you ever noticed how people begin to justify themselves when they feel something slipping away? It's almost automatic. Denise listened. She always listened. One afternoon, she received another message. Short, professional, clear. She read it, then leaned back in her chair and let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The pieces had locked into place. The timing was right. That evening, her husband showed up unannounced. That alone was telling. He stood in the doorway, trying to look relaxed, but his voice betrayed him. "Hey, I just wanted to check in." Denise nodded and stepped aside, letting him in. They sat at the same table where everything had begun, and for the first time, the silence between them felt different. He spoke first. "There's been a delay. Some things came up." Denise tilted her head slightly. "Oh?" That was all she said. He filled the space with words, explanations, assurances, half-truths. Denise didn't interrupt.
She waited, because people always reveal the most when they're nervous. When he finally stopped talking, he looked at her like he expected something. A reaction, a question, an accusation. Instead, Denise reached for the folder. Not dramatically, just calmly. She slid it across the table. "You might want to review this," she said. His expression changed. Confusion first, then concern, then something closer to fear. He flipped through the pages, his breathing shallow. The silence stretched and stretched. Finally, he looked up. "What is this?" Denise met his eyes. "The full picture," she said quietly. And for the first time since he'd asked for the divorce, he realized something he never considered. Denise hadn't been catching up. She had been waiting. And the waiting was over. He sat there longer than Denise expected. Not reading anymore, just staring at the papers as if they might rearrange themselves if he waited long enough. The confidence he'd carried for months drained quietly from his face. Denise noticed something then that she hadn't seen in years. Uncertainty. It softened him, aged him, stripped away the certainty he'd worn like armor. "What are you saying?" he finally asked. Denise didn't raise her voice, didn't lean forward. She spoke the way someone does when they already know the outcome. "I'm saying the story isn't as simple as you thought." He flipped through the pages again, slower this time, more carefully. Names he recognized, dates he remembered, decisions he thought were buried. "You signed the papers," he said, almost pleading now. "This should already be done." Denise nodded. "I did sign," she said. "I just didn't sign away the truth." That sentence landed harder than she expected, because truth has weight, and once it's placed on the table, it changes the balance immediately. He tried to regain control. "You could have said something sooner." She looked at him for a moment, then smiled softly. "You didn't ask." That was the moment he realized he had misjudged her completely. Denise wasn't reacting anymore. She was responding. He stood up, pacing now. "I don't understand how this is coming up now." Denise remained seated. "Because you weren't paying attention." Her tone wasn't sharp. It didn't need to be. The shock wasn't in her words. It was in the realization settling over him. He had assumed silence meant compliance. He had assumed calm meant surrender. He had assumed wrong. There's a moment in every confrontation when one person realizes the rules they were playing by no longer apply. This was his. Denise reached into the folder and removed one last document. She didn't slide it across the table this time. She held it. "This," she said, "is what you overlooked." He froze. The color drained from his face as he recognized it. The old safeguard. The one he thought only protected him. The one he never imagined she would understand. "I didn't know you remembered this," he said quietly. Denise nodded. "I didn't, at first." She paused. "But then I started paying attention." Silence filled the room again. But this silence was different. This one was heavy. He sat back down slowly. "What happens now?" he asked. That question, simple as it was, marked the final shift, because he wasn't leading anymore. Denise took a breath. "Now," she said, "we let things be accurate." Accuracy doesn't rush. Accuracy doesn't argue. Accuracy simply exists. And once it does, denial has nowhere to hide. She stood, gathering the folder. "We'll hear from the right people soon," she added.
They're already reviewing everything. He nodded, distracted, his mind racing. Denise walked him to the door. No drama, no final speech, just clarity. After he left, Denise stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet. The house felt different now. Not empty, balanced. She returned to the kitchen table and sat down. For the first time since all of this began, she allowed herself to feel it. Not triumph, relief. Because power doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it feels like peace. But the story wasn't over yet, because what Denise had done next wouldn't just affect him. It would ripple outward. And when others found out, the shock would be impossible to ignore. News has a way of traveling, even when no one is trying to spread it, especially when lawyers, accountants, and official letters get involved. Denise didn't announce anything. She didn't call friends to explain her side. But suddenly, people started reaching out. Not with questions, with concern. Her husband noticed the shift before she did. Meetings that were supposed to be routine became tense. Conversations ended abruptly. People who once spoke freely now chose their words carefully. He felt it before he understood it, that uneasy sense that something was wrong. Denise stayed exactly where she was, calm, steady, unbothered. And that contrast unsettled everyone. You see, when a story changes direction, the people who rush to judgment feel exposed. They start wondering what else they missed. One afternoon, Denise received a call from someone she hadn't heard from in years, a mutual acquaintance. The tone was different, careful, respectful. "I just wanted to check on you," the voice said. "I heard things might not be as simple as people thought." Denise thanked them and said little else. She didn't correct the narrative. She let it correct itself. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't need help. Meanwhile, her husband was unraveling. Not publicly, not yet, but privately, the cracks were obvious. He started calling more often, asking questions that had nothing to do with logistics and everything to do with reassurance. "Is this going to get worse? Do you know what they're saying? Can we talk about this?" Denise listened. She answered when necessary, but she no longer explained, because explanation implies doubt, and she had none. The people handling the review worked quietly, thoroughly. No rushing, no assumptions, just facts laid out in sequence. And facts, when aligned, tell a very clear story. One morning, Denise opened an envelope and knew immediately this was different. The weight of it, the tone, the wording. She read it slowly. Then she closed her eyes and took a breath. This was the moment. Not dramatic, not emotional, definitive. Later that day, her husband called. His voice was tight. "They're asking questions," he said, "detailed ones." Denise nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "They should," she replied. Silence followed. Then he said something that surprised her. "I didn't think you cared enough to look." Denise smiled. "That's the problem," she said. "You stopped noticing when I started thinking." That sentence lingered, because it wasn't an accusation, it was a truth. The shock wasn't in what Denise had done, it was in who she had been all along. People had mistaken her calm for absence, her patience for passivity, her silence for surrender. And now, the story they told themselves no longer fit the facts. The narrative shifted, not in whispers, in documentation. And once documents speak, opinions get quiet. The ripple spread. Conversations changed tone. People who once praised his decisiveness now spoke cautiously. And Denise? She kept living her life.
Same routines, same calm mornings. But now, when people looked at her, they saw something different. Not fragility, strength. The kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that waits. And the final revelation, the one no one was prepared for, was still ahead. Because what would come next wouldn't just surprise people, it would redefine everything they thought they knew.
By the time the final review was completed, the atmosphere had shifted completely. What once felt like a private matter had become something people spoke about in careful tones, not out of gossip, but out of respect for what was unfolding. Denise didn't need to be present for most of it. Her role was already written into the record. Clear, factual, unemotional. That's what made it so powerful. The findings weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. They were thorough. Money had been moved. Decisions had been made without transparency. Agreements had been interpreted conveniently. Nothing illegal at first glance, but not honest. And honesty is the line most people forget exists until they cross it. When the conclusions were laid out, there was no room left for interpretation. The narrative her husband had built collapsed under its own weight. Not with a crash, with a quiet certainty. Denise received the call late in the afternoon. She listened without interrupting. She asked one question. Is it clear? The answer came without hesitation. Yes. That was enough. Later that evening, she sat alone at her kitchen table and reflected, not on what she had gained, but on what had been revealed. People don't fall apart because they're exposed. They fall apart because they're no longer believed. Her husband found that out quickly. Calls went unanswered, doors closed, politely. Conversations ended sooner than expected. Not punishment, distance. And distance can be far more unsettling than confrontation. He tried once more to talk, not to argue, to understand. They met briefly, in a neutral space. He looked smaller somehow, older. I never thought it would go this far, he said. Denise met his eyes. It didn't go far, she replied. It went deep. That was the difference. What shocked people wasn't the outcome. It was the restraint. Denise hadn't destroyed him. She hadn't exposed him publicly. She had simply let the truth stand where everyone could see it. And that truth did all the work on its own. Friends who once took sides quietly revised their assumptions. Family members who offered sympathy now offered respect. And Denise? She moved forward. Not bitter, not triumphant, grounded. Because power doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly, sits down, and waits for the room to notice. But there was still one final moment left, one last realization that would stay with everyone long after the details faded. Because the biggest shock wasn't what Denise uncovered, it was what she never needed to say. With time, the details began to fade for everyone else. That's how these things usually go. People remember the outcome, but not the process. They forget the small moments, the quiet decisions, the patience it took to let the truth surface on its own. But Denise remembered, not with bitterness, with clarity. She noticed how differently people treated her now. Not dramatically, just differently. They listened more carefully when she spoke. They paused before offering advice. They stopped assuming she needed rescuing. Respect has a subtle weight to it. You don't notice it until it's there. Denise didn't change her routine. She didn't reinvent herself. She didn't chase validation or make grand declarations about independence. She simply continued.
And that continuity, that refusal to perform strength, became the strongest statement of all. Her husband, on the other hand, had to live with a different reality. Not punishment, awareness. Every decision he made now carried the echo of what had happened, not because Denise reminded him, because life did. There's something humbling about realizing the person you dismissed was the one paying attention all along. They crossed paths one final time months later. No tension, no anger, just distance softened by time. "I didn't see you," he admitted quietly. Denise nodded. "That was your choice." That was the last thing she said about it. And it was enough. What people took from the story varied. Some saw it as a warning, others as a lesson in patience. But for those who listened closely, it was something deeper. It was about quiet strength, about the power of observation, about knowing when not to speak. Because silence isn't emptiness, it's space. Space to think, space to plan, space to let truth step forward without interference. Denise never raised her voice, never sought revenge, never demanded acknowledgement. She simply allowed reality to arrive. And that, in the end, shocked everyone far more than anger ever could. But the final lesson, the one that stayed with those who truly understood, was still waiting to be spoken. In the end, there was no dramatic victory lap. No moment where Denise stood tall and declared she had won, because winning was never the point. What stayed with people long after the story settled was something simpler and far more unsettling. Denise had never chased control. She had simply reclaimed awareness. And awareness, once regained, changes everything. Life after the divorce wasn't perfect. It was real. There were quiet evenings, adjustments, moments of loneliness that didn't need to be explained or dramatized. But there was also something new. Peace. The kind that comes when you no longer doubt yourself. Denise understood now what she hadn't fully grasped before. Strength doesn't need permission. It doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need to be proven to people who aren't paying attention. The people who thought she had been defeated eventually realized the truth. She had been listening. And listening, when done long enough, becomes power. Her story didn't spread because she told it. It spread because others recognized themselves in it, in the patience, in the restraint, in the quiet moment where everything finally makes sense. If there was a lesson Denise carried forward, it was this: never mistake silence for weakness. Sometimes silence is strategy. Sometimes it's protection. And sometimes it's the calm before clarity. She signed the divorce papers in silence, not because she had nothing to say, but because she knew the truth would speak louder than she ever could. And when it did, everyone heard it.